gentlemen, right now sport is too international and commercial. It is treated as a business and not as a vital part of a healthy community. The profit incentives of private owners drive Manchester United to spend most of their budget on marketing efforts in Asian countries, or for NFL teams to move to bigger cities just to earn more profits, completely disregarding their own local fans. This is problematic because sport doesn't have any intrinsic value, but the value is only achieved by the fans following that sport. Private ownership prioritizes monetary incentives over the interests of local fans, and the benefits these communities would get, such as access to training facilities or emotional benefits like seeing your favorite team live, are often lost. Team Estonia prefers a world where Manchester United in the UK focuses on the Manchester community and Santos in Brazil focuses on the Santos community. The plan we propose to you today is the following. Fans will now buy out the club from the previous owner. If that's not possible, then state will buy and then resell the shares to the fans, and for a smaller amount of money if that's necessary. The clubs would have to be 100% owned by the community, but one individual can't own more than 1% of the club. All of the owners have to be residents in the local community, so Manchester United can be owned by their fans only living in the Manchester area and not in any foreign countries. 3 arguments in our case today. Firstly, how we can advance the local community. Then secondly, how we can make sport more enjoyable for all fans. And then thirdly, our second speaker is going to tell you how we can have a higher political diversity in sports through this community ownership. Starting with our first argument. Professional sports teams have the biggest impact on those fans who reside in their area, as it is the easiest for them to go and see the games, or they are impacted the most when a new stadium is built for training. We could enhance the experience these fans get if they own those teams in 3 ways. No, thank you. Firstly, this happens through accessibility. Right now, the goal of individuals or corporations owning those teams is to get profit. In real life, this means that they set up high ticket prices and create luxury seats in those stadiums just to earn as much money as possible. Well, the goal of the community is to make the experience of seeing your favorite team more accessible for everyone, as the fans are owning it and they want to make it accessible for themselves. For this, they set up lower ticket prices and create bigger stadiums with more seats, like we already see that Bundesliga has the cheapest ticket prices in all of European leagues. Or through policies like done by the community-owned team Nashville Predators, who have in some games only sold tickets to the community just to ensure access. So with community ownership, more fans can go and see their games, and quantitatively more fans can enjoy those games. And because the value of sports is only achieved through those fans, we are quantitatively getting a higher value if we increase the accessibility of those fans, while international fans are not affected. No, thank you. The accessibility and the interest of local fans is already compromised in the status quo, where teams leave their historical local backgrounds just to move to bigger cities. This is happening due to individual owners prioritizing money over the interest of local fans, so when staying in a certain city becomes unprofitable, they will move to another one to earn more money. We have already seen it happen in 2016 in the US, where 3 out of 24 NFL teams moved to bigger cities like LA just to increase their profits, completely disregarding their old fans. No, thank you. The impact of this is that the loyal fans there are let down, who have invested their money and time into supporting their favorite teams, and they're also losing all of the accessibility they would have to those games. This is something that would never happen on our side when those teams would be locally tied and owned by those communities. No, thank you. So they would still be able to support their favorite teams. A second way how the community experience is enhanced is through integration. And firstly, this is bigger through accessibility. Because when people of different backgrounds can come together and bond through a positive experience, the integration is more likely to happen. No, thank you, because they're coming together under one banner. This is something that is more likely to happen when there is a higher accessibility, the ticket prices are cheaper, and you don't have to watch the game from your couch, but you can just actually go and unite with other fans in those stadiums, and through their integration is possible of happening inside that one community. But a second way how integration is happening is through teams creating it with the funds they have. Like, for example, we have seen the Swedish Cricket Federation using their funds to integrate minorities and refugees with the larger population, or we have the Dalkurd FF, which is an all-Kurdish football team in the Swedish league, and they are promoting integration with Kurds with the larger Swedish population. Things that are only possible if the community can direct funds to the interest that they have and choose that integration is the most important for them. A third way how we can increase the community experience is through local sport. Firstly, how we can increase the community sports is because the community has incentive to build sporting venues that are not only good for the sports teams, but also accessible by the people living in that community. So because the private owners never have the incentive of creating a sporting venue that is accessible by the local people because they just don't care. However, the community can do this if they are interested in promoting the health of those local people and their accessibility to sports. But secondly, this also happens through unlocking youth potential in those areas through like building youth academies, or we have seen a supporters trust for Coventry City Football Club who raised funds just to save the Football Club Youth Academy, which was threatened with closure by private owners. It shows how the different priorities of the owners can enhance the experience of both the youth and the general community in that area. So through that, we are increasing the benefits that professional sports teams have on those teams when they reside in one certain area. Before moving on to my second argument, go.
This debate is about the principle of ownership. What in your world is the difference between a consumer and an owner?
We see that like the difference between the consumer and owner, we see that it's to an extent it is like similar. We say that the owner is, in this case, is important, that is the fan, because we have to prioritize the owners based on who gets the most benefits. And we say because fans are the ones gaining the most benefit, they should be the owners, and they should be able to decide how they are affected and how their consumership is affected. And this is the reason why we think that principally it is also justified to give this ownership to those fans. Moving on to my second argument on how sport can become more enjoyable. Firstly, this happens when sport becomes more competitive, because right now the richest teams buy the best players from smaller teams, creating a huge gap between them and all of the other teams, which results in no real competition happening. So how we can change that is because local communities are less likely to pay as much money for those like huge players, and because they have less profit incentives and they want to spend this money on their own interests. Like we see, like Neymar costs $200 million. This huge amount of money could be spent on any of the other goals that the community had, like building better venues or creating cheaper ticket prices or having integration, things that the communities care about and the private owners never do. No, thank you. So the impact of this is when we have less players purchased, we have a less of a gap between all of those teams, and we can have more competition. And even if they wouldn't buy all of those players for such a high amount of money, we say, or even if they would buy those players, we say that it's the fans' decision and it's legitimate because they are the owners and they can decide how their experience is created. But how we can make this more enjoyable through this higher competition is because people enjoy the thrill of sport and the hope of winning. And this is bigger with a level playing field because you never know who is going to win if the teams are on a more like even level. And furthermore, we can have quantitatively more games that are interesting every single year, like when on the example of La Liga where only Real Madrid and Barcelona are competing, then on our side there would be more teams and you could go see more competitive games. And secondly, enjoyment also comes from a higher community feeling. Like if you bought those shares, you feel you have like skin in the game, you have invested money, you're part of the contest, or if you didn't buy it, through higher accessibility, you can unite more with other fans and get this higher community feeling. We already see that this is happening on the example of Green Bay Packers, which is the only community-owned team in NFL who sells out all of their games, and their fan base is considered the most loyal in NFL, things that all the other teams which are owned by private owners rarely can claim to be true for themselves in NFL. So it shows that this community feeling can come to community ownership, and because Team Estonia enhances the experience of all fans and gets greater benefits from the existence of professional sports teams, please vote proposition.
But before that, this first speaker, her speech was long, 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
this proposition would have you believe that on the basis of the fact that you live in Manchester, you happen to love Manchester United, then the multi-million pound income represented by South Korean fans after signing Park Ji-suk. We don't think that a local community has more of a claim to ownership than anyone else who contributes to that team. And on that basis, we think that we would not require them to own these teams. What are some Team South Africa bringing with? 3 takeaways. Firstly, that communities have no unique principled claim to ownership of a corporate entity. Secondly, that enforcing a structure on them is likely to cripple both the team and the community, but moreover will be proving it in the second speech how it harms the nature of sports as a whole. It's important to note here, we do not oppose community ownership in all of its forms. We believe that clubs ought to be allowed to pick the one that is best for them, and therefore we ought not impose a structure on them. Given that, let's start firstly with Rebuttal, right? Note here that we never actually get any analysis as to why these communities own these. The only thing that we get in terms of why they own them is the idea that they benefit the most from them. So if I can show you that making the teams own making the communities own the teams is likely to cripple them, they don't have any principle or any efficacy. But let's talk about the things they did give us, right? They firstly try and tell you that sport is more accessible, right? At no point do they tell you why it's highly inaccessible now, right? Why corporate entities have no incentive to provide for their communities. Because it's important to note that only 3 English Premiership teams are actually profitable. That means that sport is not done for a profit incentive. Sport is done on the basis of the fact that they can care for that team, but they actually care about that team, right? We think that this idea that sport suddenly is likely to become more accessible isn't true. But also it begins to logically fail when they give you more analysis as to why it's likely to be so. They talk about things like building bigger stadiums, which can sing up to the tune of 400 million. They tell you about things like making more seats available, which is extremely expensive. That's not something that comes out of nowhere. The point at which a team is owned by a community is likely to make sports significantly less accessible on their side. The second thing they tell you about is how you can stop these teams from leaving the communities which invested into them so much. They omit the context here that teams usually only leave the point at which they begin failing in that community, right? They begin failing, which means that community did not give them what they needed, right? But then moreover, these communities can actually stop those teams from leaving. That when teams in the NFL threaten to leave their own communities, they're able to pressure them into staying, right? This context is important because it means that sport is not completely inaccessible and that communities have a say over how they operate now. The third thing they try and tell you is how they spend money on their own interests, right? At no point do they tell you why communities who they characterize as so invested are unlikely to want the next Ronaldo on their own team and therefore offer as much money as they can to actually buy them, right? But we think that spending money on their own interests is something that they largely won't want to do, right? That money is going to be funneled into things like building their bigger stadiums, like getting better players. The thrill of sport comes from the players and those things, and which are extremely expensive that they don't get rid of on their side. But lastly here, they tell us about something like team loyalty, right? Ignoring the fact that even though Arsenal's private and has been failing for about 16 years, they still have a very loyal fan base, right? We don't think loyalty is inherent to that ownership. That loyalty can exist beyond that ownership. That loyalty can exist beyond that community, right? What I've proven to you here is how we think that you don't get any of their benefits. If anything, they're likely to make that situation significantly worse on their side. Given that, let's start with the arguments. And the first one here is on legitimate ownership. The first layer of which is why we think private ownership is a legitimate structure of ownership. And there are two criteria upon which ownership is considered legitimate. The first of which is creation. At the point at which you create something, you ought to deserve that ownership to it because it is your product, right? It's worth noting that most private entities, most sports teams are actually created by private entities within those communities. So how Chelsea was made by a private owner and then named after the closest borough, right? Meaning that they're named after those communities but are not created by them, right? This is important because we think that since they started as corporate entities, they have no direct obligation to that community, and their success does not mean that you ought to start impeding on their autonomy as a team. The second part is that when there is a legitimate transfer of ownership, this is in the instance in which the communities did make these teams. We still think the fact that they are privately owned now is signaling a legitimate transfer of ownership. So the point at which a sale is made, and that is one which is mutually beneficial. The communities can get money from that team in alleviation of their responsibility, and those private entities can get those teams. We think that is a legitimate transaction and one we think we ought to respect. And on that basis of those two criteria, we think it is legitimate ownership. But secondly, let's talk to you about the distinction between a consumer and an owner, right? Because we try to make them actually analyze this and we don't get a response. The difference between a consumer and an owner is that an owner contributes directly to a product without getting a reciprocal service. What owners get largely is often just more like decision making and more responsibility. What fans get and supporters get is entertainment. The They buy shirts and they buy tickets so they can access that experience, and that is what they get in return. It is akin to someone funding money into their favorite series because they like that series. We don't allow them to edit Game of Thrones because they really like the characters, right? Their passion does not equate to a claim of ownership because they don't fulfill the criteria for what an owner is. What they have to prove to us is why other bodies who contribute directly and significantly, like players, like managers, like sundry workers, like coaches, who contribute significantly and get something in return, do not have that claim to ownership. And then the third argument, which is even if they have a legitimate claim to ownership, I think that it is abhorrent that it is local communities, that it is restrictive firstly on the basis of fan intensity, that some fans may not want to own their teams, that some communities may not want to own their teams because they don't feel as intensely about their sport. That is a legitimate expression of community autonomy that they throttle on their side. But the second part is that it's unfair on the basis of geography, that it tells Manchester United fans in South Korea that their support does not mean as much as the support of people in Manchester. We think that that is abhorrent. Geography is an arbitrary basis upon which to base what an owner really is. What you're getting from this argument is that they have no unique principled claim to that ownership and therefore ought not be required to own. Yes?
In the case of monopolies, we take away private property because it has a negative effect on the consumer. Why is this not an analogous case?
Because sport cares about the people, that sports prioritize the interests of their fans. They listen to their fans when they say that we don't want this coach, we don't want this player, we don't want you to move. It is not as exclusive as like some pharmaceutical company trying to own an entire market. So the second part of my case is essentially why it harms sub-functionality. There are two things we must understand. Firstly, the expenses of a team, right? That aside from running costs, they have to pay for things like player wages and player signing, but secondly, facility upgrades, which we already understand can be extremely expensive. But the important thing about these costs is that they vary significantly. So it's not just one uniform cost which can always be prepared for. But the second part is on the revenue streams, and there are four of them. One, broadcasting rights. Secondly, sponsorships. Thirdly, tickets and merchandise from consumers. And fourthly, prize money. All of which are highly volatile, that they can depend on the club's performance, but even if the club is performing optimally, they depend on the financier's ability. The sports piece is able to withdraw from Kenyan rugby, not because Kenyan rugby is failing, but because they cannot afford it anymore. They're extremely volatile. What happens on this side, that they created this jump between what owners can provide and what clubs are going to need. Because clubs regularly face instances in which their expenses are greater than their income. And when that happens, communities are shouldered with debt singing to the tune of $300, $400 million, something we don't think is legitimate. It pushes these communities into crippling debt in trying to save those teams, because we think that they can't invest the same $1 billion that Roman Abramovich has invested in Chelsea, right? But beyond that, we think that it's likely to cripple those teams. They don't have what they need, and they begin to erode the very pleasure and the very nature of sports when they begin to force it on these communities who can't handle it, crippling the teams and crippling those communities. We in opposition value ownership in all of its transient forms, but specifically value ownership that makes sport better for consumers, that makes teams better for themselves, and on that basis, we gladly oppose.
Opposition side just claims that sports teams care about fans, and they actually give no analysis or counter-analysis. How we showed you, because of profit incentives, for example, NFL loyal fans who watch their sports are left out because the teams literally leave, because they just want more profit. They just tell us that they care about fans. We give an analysis how that is actually in most cases not true. We are going to prove to you that those incentives are harmful and that our ownership model could be comparatively a lot better. In my speech, firstly, I'll do rebuild. Secondly, I have straight rebuttals against your arguments, and I'm going to further extend on how our local community-owned teams are going to increase political diversity in sports. Firstly, the rebuild. They say about accessibility that right now there's no incentive for these teams to not provide lower ticket sales. We think that there is an incentive. The incentive is to get as much profit as available, right? If you have increased ticket sales, then you're going to get more money from that because the tickets cost more, right? We see that this is a current case in which many fans, local fans, are left out because they cannot have access to those tickets. In those cases, these people are actually left out. We see that we can, on our side, this accessibility point gets better for everyone, right? Now, secondly, they tell us that about the NFL example, that these three teams only left because they were starting to fail. This is not true. These three teams in NFL left because they wanted to get more profit. These teams weren't on the verge of collapsing. They were really successful clubs, but they just decided in LA we can get more profit. We don't care about the local fans in here. That's why we're going to leave. This is a clear harm that we get on the profit incentives they are actually supporting. Right? Then they tell us that in the cases that these community teams can still buy, for example, Ronaldo, because that is the thing that they want. And yes, we agree to that. Rino said in her speech that if the community decides that we should buy Neymar for 200 million, that is a totally fair thing to say, because the ownership of community decides that. The fans decide that, and they think that is the best thing for them to do. That's why their goals of the local community are still fulfilled, and that's why it still stands, right? We say that they gave us no answer to our integration point, how local sports actually get better, and how competition on our side is also better. We are really looking to those answers as well. But now, let's move to straight rebuttal. Firstly, about private property, and is it justified to take this or not? We say that it's totally justified that the local people actually have a claim. Firstly, because we say that these people that right now own the clubs are reimbursed, right? The analogy here is eminent domain. State forces you to sell your private property if it is actually beneficial for the state. For example, when states build highways and your land is on the way, you're forced to sell. That ownership of the land or owner of the club gets the money he deserves for the club, so he's not being stolen off his private property, right? Second point, we say that state forces people to give away their private property if it is harmful for the consumers. In the case, the analogy here is antitrust laws in the case of monopolies, right? We say, our arguments show why these profit incentivized teams are right now harmful to consumers. That's why this analogy works, and that's why we can still take this private property from them. Third point of answer, we say that the sports clubs are parts of the fans' identities. Fans should have a right to dictate how their identity is shared, how it's perceived, and put into practice. Our ownership model achieved this, theirs doesn't. States already, for example, nationalize theaters, so they will succeed. This proves to you that states also nationalize things when the benefit could be bigger, not only that there's harm to consumers. We say that because of these reasons, these people have a totally local and justified claim to this right. Then let's tell us about geography is arbitrary. Yes, we agree to some point, but that is the reality that we're actually living in, and the reality that we're actually, in most cases, debating. We say that because of this arbitrary factor, these are the people who live in the local community could have the biggest impact from this policy. That's why we should do this policy. Then they finally tell us about how these four sources of incomes for these clubs are really volatile, right? We say, yes, this is true, but we're talking here about professional teams. Usually professional teams share the trait of having very loyal and life-longing fans. In the cases of you, for example, we don't think it's a tangible scenario where nobody supports Arsenal anymore, for example, because they are failing as a team or they don't win enough games. We think there are always going to be Arsenal fans. There are always going to be fans that are actually fanatical about their teams, and that's why these four sources aren't so volatile. Then finally, they talk about billionaires' money. No, thank you. We say that there's a very small minority of clubs that actually get money from billionaires investing, right? And even if that's lost on our side, firstly, like I mentioned, that is a 0.1% of clubs that actually get money from billionaires. Secondly, it is already being fought against. For example, financial fair play rules by FIFA that are being enforced. This means that you as a club can't be in debt for too long, otherwise you're going to face sanctions, right? Thirdly, we say that clubs being successful or having these billionaires' money is actually harmful to the competitiveness point. For example, in the France League, PSG, the France League was really fine until PSG started started buying players with billionaires' investment. Now PSG wins every time. This is a competitiveness point that still remains on our side, and this actually shows you how these clubs are going to get worse, how everybody is going to have a worse spawning scenario because of these billionaires' investments. Before I move to extension, I'll take it.
Real Madrid and Barcelona are community owned but are still extremely expensive to watch and to go visit. How do you change that on your side?
We think that, for example, talking about the richest clubs in the world, we think there's also inherent distinction, right? Even if it's true that, for example, Real Madrid and Barcelona are the most expensive and win every year, there's a distinction between Real Madrid and Barcelona winning because they are supported by their fans and have the biggest fan base versus them winning because they have billionaires investing that money into those clubs. So I think it is still fairer under our model as well, and this is why this still stands. No, thank you. Moving on to extension, how local community-owned teams are going to increase political diversity in sports. We see that currently sports teams have an incentive to suppress political views to increase their profits, right? Political views divide the viewers to certain groups and make them not watch that sport in protest, resulting in reduced profits for the team owners. This was showcased in the NFL involving a scandal with a player named Colin Kaepernick, right? He refused to stand for the US anthem to protest against police brutality, and this caused massive polarization within the NFL viewers. People who didn't agree with his views started to boycott games. There was a universal loss of viewership and active criticism of the NFL as a whole. This in total resulted in an 11% decrease in NFL viewership. Now, therefore, there are only two choices for these teams currently. Suppress the player and his political views and cater to the majority to get as much profit as possible, or second choice, ignore to protest and polarization, causing even bigger decrease rates. We say that when these sports teams are individual or corporation owned, they will always suppress the players because of massive profit incentives. Things have even gone so far that Kaepernick isn't playing for any team because other teams wouldn't sign him because they feel he could be negative for their profits. This comparatively doesn't happen on our side for two reasons. The first reason is that teams are looking for massive profit, and second reason, the community has a say in what should be done. For example, if we analyze the case of Colin Kaepernick, his home fans, 64% of the home fans showed general support to his protest. This means that he wouldn't have faced any punishment on our side, that comparatively he had punishment on their side. We say that if the club hadn't been forced to cater to all of the NFL fans, but was able to focus more on the direction of the community, Kaepernick wouldn't have been punished. We say, and even if the scenario is now that fans decide to limit political speech, it is still better comparatively, because basically the club represents what the fans believe in. Only type of political speech that can be actually censored is the one that the majority of fans actually agree with. So on the offside, that is totally fine as well. So the impact of this argument is that we think that sport is a mechanism that unites everybody, despite their social, economic, or political background. For example, the case of Colin Kaepernick, he started a nationwide debate about police brutality, and these cases are more likely to happen on the outside because the community has a say in what should be done. So Colin Kaepernick wouldn't be punished in the first place, and secondly, there are massive profit incentives that have actually suppress these players. On the outside, these things happen more frequent. That's why we have more benefits. For all of these reasons, vote Team Estonia. Thank you.
So the second speaker on the position, his speech was 8 minutes and 11 seconds. I would like to take the second speaker of the position, his speech, and would like to invite the second speaker of the position to the word there.
Team South Africa values a trend when Ivorians can support Chelsea simply because they represent Didier Drogba and similarly represent all of Africa at the same time. Under Proposition Side and Team Estonia's team, that is no longer possible simply because they were unfortunate enough not to be close enough to the stadium to derive the very benefits that they want, and they were punished by the arbitrary metric of geography. We first have to assess the main problem within the debate thus far, which is the strategy that this team has adopted. Because importantly, the core of this case here is the legitimacy of ownership and when that can be required to change. Their principle is entirely hung on the fact that a consumer has entitlement to ownership if they are going to derive benefits from that. That is strategically dangerous, panel, because all we have to do is show that even in marginal circumstances there will be harms to these consumers to disprove all of their principle. But secondly, we don't have any substantial responses to our principle then in terms of what ownership actually means. And so finally then, in terms of the strategy of the principle, we're still fine, note, with a system of public ownership if teams choose that that is what's optimal for them. We just don't believe that every club should be required to be owned by their local community. So what do we give you under this principle? We show you that the principle of ownership is when there is a legitimate transfer, when there is creation of that product. Similarly, we show you that this principle is universally applicable to most of these clubs, whereby those private owners have actually deserved to own them. They have been doing actively beneficial things in terms of getting them out of debt. The only responses that we get here is that the state is justified, one, in breaking up monopolies, two, in nationalizing something that will be beneficial to the people. A few responses. One, when it comes to nationalizing things like streets, houses, when you want to build a street, you require an extent of consent from the actor. They don't show us why private corporates are going to consent, nor why it's legitimate to force them into such a contract. Two, what's happening here is not an extent of nationalization, but rather the fact that the people are required to run it. That then means that you require community consensus, which they also don't prove that you're going to get, because if your club is entirely in debt, they don't actually show you why you're willing to run it. This is distinctly different from something like a national theatre, where the state will be capable of running it in that way. And then finally, when it comes to this example of monopolies, recognize that it is a very competitive industry, and subsequently you don't have tangible harms to the consumer that literally cripple them in terms of buying things like bread or food. That's when the state actually gets involved in things like monopolies and breaking them up. So now let's look at their point then of creating better community access. So here we already show you a few things on how communities are actually harmed, but notice how none of this is actually inherent to what they're trying to do. If they're concerned about things like ticket prices, then they could do something like regulate that. They don't show us why ownership is the most important way to do that. But secondly, it's important to recognize that accessibility can still be gained. Why? Because a profit incentive means that often these companies are willing to conform to the fans' desires regardless of what happens. For example, in Newcastle, they changed the name of the stadium to sportsdirect.com Stadium, which the fans heavily protested. The new fluid owners that came in then changed it back due to that protest. Ultimately, we can still get community access under our side. They need to show you why private ownership in all circumstances means that fans never enjoy the match, and there are no fans that can ever find any value in that match. But even if accessibility is what this is about, notice that that's still something we're fine with under our side, because a lot of their benefits have been achieved under the status quo, where when people realize that the club is failing, they're willing to opt into a system of public ownership, like the Green Bay Packers did. They're willing to say that, okay, we don't think we can do this anymore, maybe we're going to sell shares to the community. That's still something that's fine. They need to show you why it should be required in all instances. Then their point of integration and what that means. Ultimately, it's important to recognize actual incentives of the fans here, because it was the American fans that were angry at Kaepernick. It was the American fans in baseball that protested when they had too many women on the board of the Toledo Mudhens. Those are the types of fans that they're giving ownership to, and they think they're going to get an extent of integration. They can't actually meaningfully prove this, but similarly, they need to show us why local community integration is more valuable than integration of people from various international communities as well. What is my substantive? But before that,
under your side, no international or local fans have a say in what the club should do or what the policies are. Under our side, at least local fans do, because we provide them this ownership model.
Okay, so if you're all about accessibility, you need to prove why these people and only these people deserve accessibility from sport. That's a burden on your side that you have to deal with. What is my substantive? I'm going to be proving the effect on sports if this policy is implemented now, and how ultimately that is detrimental in their policy. Recognize, panel, that this is implemented in a context whereby some of these clubs already have this optimal structure and others don't, based on what is optimal for them. That means that the first level is how smaller teams and clubs are disproportionately harmed by this blanket policy. Why? Because large clubs like Real Madrid and Barcelona that can afford to do this and have things like 90,000 shareholders are put at a massive disadvantage. A disadvantage whereby they're the clubs that can afford to buy the most successful players from overseas, which they still do even though they're community owned, at the next transfer window. They can generate a self-perpetuating cycle of success because they have large fan bases that allow them to get more money and in turn get more players. By comparison, the smaller teams in this cycle are disproportionately disadvantaged because they're stuck in a cycle whereby they need fans to try and get money, but they need money to try and get players that will get them fans. And often these smaller teams and smaller, poorer communities don't have fans in the first place. They need to deal with that.
But this is comparatively worse under your side, because nobody's going to invest into small leagues because there are no profit incentives. At least we have some fans.
Okay, cool.
With these
That's
things.
actually not the case. Usually, investment in smaller communities is much greater because of the underdog narrative. That's why Wonga invested in Newcastle and Disney invested in things like Wolverhampton. But why is that worse under their side? In the German mandated system of ownership, on a 51-49% ownership split between private and corporate ownership, smaller communities were effectively shielded off from private investment because those private investors could only match what the community was willing to offer. By comparison, Bayern Munich was in one of the richest areas in Germany and could therefore garner the most success. This is also true for smaller sports in the first case that also need capital injection to become popular because they don't have a following under their side. Sports like darts and hockey would just not exist because of the small community followings under their side. But finally then, these investors are often valuable in supporting a global trend of the development of sport, whereby people can come together to collectively celebrate the elation of victory or commiserate the tragedy of loss in a way that transcends community backgrounds, cultural and linguistic diversity. For instance, Vivek Ranade is a multi-millionaire owner of the NBA Sacramento Kings. He invested significant amounts of money to developing Indian basketball leagues and youth leagues with his money to expand that. Ultimately, this is a valuable trend of globalization because all people can get the benefits of accessibility that they so desperately want on Team Estonia, but they take that away by categorizing them on local markets and this arbitrary metric where these clubs are less likely to take in those markets. Smaller teams need a bigger goalpost to score. All Team Estonia does is add another goalkeeper.
Honourable panel, the community-owned AFC Wimbledon Football Club in the UK received the highest graded award attainable in the National Football Association in recognition of the club's outstanding coaching facilities in the local community. The club aimed to reach as many children as possible through their football and multi-sports programme. These sorts of community benefits are what we want to achieve. These are also the same benefits that are going to be impeded by the profit incentives that are going to be coming under opposition's plan. I want to talk about two main things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to look at whether it is justified and who actually has a right to own these clubs. And then secondly, I'm going to look at how it is actually going to tangibly affect the fans. So first off, is it justified? Firstly, I'm going to look at who really has a right to these clubs. They said that communities do not have a right to these teams and characterised it as fans only get entertainment. We don't agree with this characterisation. We think that being a fan means that it's also part of your identity. When you support Manchester United, you identify yourself as a Manchester United fan, which is really important. When we talk about autonomy and the fact that who gets to determine the identity of these fans, which is really relevant in our extension where we talked about the fact, that most fans of Copernic actually supported his political stance, which means that in the status quo, private entities and private owners can determine the way in which the image and which the identity of these fans is being conveyed. And we think this is a much stronger justification of who gets to own these fans than just having lots of money and being a millionaire and being able to buy this club. But they also say that private entities, have a right because have bought it, but we talk a lot about the fact that in the case of monopolies, we already take private property away. Note that their characterization in this case is also not true, because we don't take the property away, not because people are customers, but because the customers suffer. The customers are the people who are now actively being damaged, and we show you, no thank you, how fans are also actively being damaged by having private ownership. When they say that sport cares about its fans, no thank you, then the real world shows otherwise. We talked about the fact how 3 out of 24 NFL teams moved just to increase their profits. It wasn't something that they had to do. We think that this was just so that their overall revenue would be increased, or the fact that Coventry City, no thank you, almost had their youth academy taken away from private entities who didn't want to lose their money. We think that even if they somehow manage to prove that these private entities do care about the fans, then they need to understand, no thank you, that profit incentive is never going to allow them to have programs that don't bring money in. When we talk about youth academies, when we talk about integration, these are things that don't bring you any revenue and are only going to come if the overall community wants to have it. No thank you. But the other thing that they talk a lot about is international fans and how we are somehow doing harm to them. 2 responses. Firstly, I don't understand how they are actually catering to them or what actual benefits they are giving to them. But secondly, we don't bring any harm to them. International fans get their benefit from watching sport on TV, which means, no thank you, that we are not doing harm to them. There's really an irrelevant group in this debate. We think that none of us are really actually affecting how this group is actually going to perceive themselves or how they're going to be watching sports. We don't think that we should be talking to them about them in this debate. No thank you. They also say that smaller teams suffer proportionally more under our case, but they don't really compare it with their world, where also no private money is being injected into these smaller teams, as you can't get a very large profit out of these smaller teams, which means that the overall argumentation is very symmetrical. We also think that we comparatively are making the gap between smaller teams and larger teams a lot smaller because less private money is being injected into the elite teams. We talk about Manchester United and Chelsea, no thank you, which also means that the competition that we talked a lot about in our first speech, in our second argument about making sport more enjoyable, is also enforced. The last point I want to make under this fact about whether it is justified is that they talked about darts and hockey in sort of niche areas. We think that firstly, these sports, if they are very small and niche, probably are very cheap to actually uphold, which means that the fans that they have can probably buy the shares. But secondly, even if they can't, then our model deals with this. We talked about the fact that the states can buy these shares and possibly, no thank you, sell it to the fans at a lower price, and we think that the state can take that hit. But now, moving on to the second point, let's look at how it actually affects the fans. Note that we also don't actually have to prove that these fans are always going to be making the right decision for their community. We only have to prove that the fans, when they want to make a decision, can enact that decision, and that we are granting this autonomy to them. But sure, before I move on, right.
Should popular shows and TV artists have access to copyrights?
Well, I think that's not really the case because having a TV show this is not bringing harm to the viewers, so we don't think this is analogous in this debate. But now let's look at how it affects the fans. Firstly, they did some sort of model bashing and asked, is the owner going to give some sort of consent? This is not really important. When we talk about eminent domain, then the state takes away private property anyway, especially in the case of monopoly. Under them, the owner is also never going to give up these shares, even if the community wants it, because it doesn't want to lose any sort of profit. They also ask, do the fans even want this power to have this club? We think that of course they want to. We talked about the harms that come from having a private owner, which means that the fans have a very large incentive to actually take over. For example, during the Green Bay Packers are fan owned, and they are the largest NFL team to have the largest fan support group. So we do think that there is some sort of incentive for these fans to take power. But they ask whether there is they question whether there even is an accessibility problem, and whether local fans remain the most important group in this debate. We think that local fans are obviously the ones that are going to be impacted the most, of getting accessibility in these games. For example, the New York Knicks often play in Madison, which is where you have very high ticket prices, which means that poor fans can't watch their favorite team actually play live, and they are confined to their living room. No, thank you. And we think that this is unjustified, and we think that if New York Knicks was community owned, then they wouldn't be playing at Madison, or at least they might be they might have cheaper tickets. But even if there is not an accessibility problem in all cases, then what our model does is that when there is an accessibility problem, which is going to happen at some time in the real world, then there is a mechanism to protect these overall sportsmen, or to protect these fans in such a case. But now, They also talk about the fact that how will we know like that the community is going to prioritise the local community at all? We think that firstly, it is highly likely that the local community is obviously going to have an incentive to actually provide some sort of benefits to the local community. Because when we look at priorities, then obviously the private owner, the overall benefits or the well-being of the community is going to be substandard to just increasing profits. No, thank you. But when you have a community-owned local sports club, it is much more likely that you're going to actually like make sure, or that you're going to be more interested in the fact that there is good integration in your community, because you are going to be harmed if there isn't, and you're taking much larger interest in that fact. But even if we didn't prove that, or even if we don't prove that all communities are really invested in their local community, then there's still like falls under our case, because we talked about the fact that autonomy is really important for the fans. If fans don't want to help their community and they really want to, for example, buy Neymar, then we allow them to do that. We grant them this autonomy because the fans have a right to this. The fans have a right to overall like dictate like what their sports team is like, but this is like the most important for them. Overall their identity and how they actually perceive the game and how they want their overall local sports team, who has a lot of power in their communities, to actually impact their overall like their overall surroundings. So we think that we have proved the fact that fans do have some sort of wish to grant autonomy, and actually will use this very effectively. And we think that due to all of these reasons, we have won this debate. Thank you.
Thank you. This speech lasted 8 minutes and 3 seconds. I would like to thank the third speaker of the proposition for their speech, and would like to invite the third speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
Panel, do not get lost in the rhetoric of proposition, because this is not a debate about whether community ownership should exist in any form. This is a debate about whether communities should be able to choose what structure best works for them and giving them autonomy. Because what did they have to do to win this debate? Either prove an inherent claim to ownership for communities that transcends benefits, that transcends profits, but secondly, if that wasn't true, they had to prove there was a barrier to ownership for these communities under the system if they chose to be community owners and weren't able to do so. At the point they dismally failed both those criteria, opposition is going to take this debate. Then, what does this debate fall into? 3 clashes. First, the principle of ownership. Secondly, is accessibility and community benefit ruined by profit incentive? And thirdly, better, more competitive sports. Now, onto the principle of ownership. They tell us 3 things here. Firstly, that those who benefit most from the sports club should be able to own them. 2 quick responses to this. That firstly, no, that's not how ownership works, because there are many people who actually benefit. It's that they started out as private clubs for private goods, and they aren't like a community good, a public good that everyone can benefit off of. It's a minority of fans that find value out of it. Why should the state have to take on the burden of the £200 million debt of Portsmouth at the cost of meaningful welfare programs? It should be something the communities choose to, something the communities want. But secondly, they make no distinction between who with the clubs, who value the clubs most. Because why do the 30 million Manchester United fans who spend $150 million each year on Manchester United goods and have each time in Manchester goes to them have solo games, why are they any less invested and any less benefited by the actions of the clubs and owning their clubs? They make no distinction between the people who are just as invested, the workers, international foreign fans, the managers and the players who are just as invested and benefit from the success. They need to make that distinction. Why do they not have that claim to ownership? But the second thing they tell us here is that communities should be able to control their reputations and how they are shown. So firstly, this is actually hung that your entire reputation of a community is based off that one sports club. It's honestly nonsensical that the Washington Redskins, because they might have an insensitive logo, doesn't mean everybody in Washington is represented that way and their reputation is shown that way. We think that how does it tangibly affect you? The private owners still have the incentive to act in the interests and reputations and representation of the communities because they derive a lot of income and support from that base. They show no reason why that wouldn't happen. We think that the 50% of Colin Kaepernick fans who weren't okay with the protest were justified, and the private club was justified in not supporting his protest. But lastly, the principle for ownership is that a monopoly must be broken down at the point it creates that barrier to ownership. Or firstly, they don't understand what a monopoly actually is, because it isn't that a majority of the clubs or businesses are privately owned. A monopoly is where one company or one individual owns all the businesses in that sector, owns all the companies, all the clubs. That no one company or one individual owns all the clubs in Manchester or Premier League clubs, owns all the league clubs. There's still lots of competition between who wins. It's not a monopoly. We don't have to base on antitrust laws. They're losing on the most important thing in this debate. They're losing on why the inherent principle must always exist. It's too late for them to fix this in their reply. We think why then we still on to the second clash of why community accessibility is not ruined by profit incentive. It first tells us here about cheaper stadiums, cheaper tickets, bigger stadiums, cheaper tickets, and they work in the community's interests. Firstly, they give no meaningful analysis of why sports is a profit incentive-driven business, because we gave you levels that were not responded to. It's that the Premier League, the most profitable and watched league in all of sport, only has 3 profitable teams. The others are all running at a loss or not making a profit at all. That's because owners want to own them, they want to invest, and they want to have this club that they are part of. And it's not a profit-driven business when the most profitable league in the world is in like £200 million of debt. We understand that since their revenue streams are very volatile, but even they can't always rely on their fans, because when Arsenal lost the FA Cup final, they couldn't even fill half the stadiums because fans were angry that their volatile streams or viewership cannot be relied on. I think it's not a profit incentive that drives these clubs. We don't see why they wouldn't act in community interest and why high ticket prices aren't still justified and why high ticket prices would exist. Because there are instances where community ownership, where private ownership acts in the interests of the community. Derek Jeter, the private owner of the Miami Dolphins in America, a football team, has invested $1 million into local rehab centers because he cares about the community, he cares about the support, he cares about them coming into his game because that money matters, the profit matters to them. But still, no analysis of why it's so inaccessible to the communities, why it's so anti-communities and detrimental to them, why the communities can't just buy them out. That's what happened with Portsmouth when they had £100 million debt and they had a string of bad owners. The community just bought them, but then they went back into private ownership. That flexibility and allows to change ownership structures. I'll take you off this. It's something we value for clubs. They have proven no barrier, no principle. They're going to lose this debate. Yes.
Private owners can afford to sell fewer tickets for higher prices, compromising the accessibility of both international and local fans. How is this something
they want the fans to come again, because if they sell more expensive tickets, less people will come. We see no reason why they'd want to shut out the very people they derive most of their income from. Okay, so now on to the secondly about whether clubs will stay in the communities and why it's valuable. Firstly, we think that the fans have significant sway over major decisions, even within private ownership structures. That's when the Atlanta Rams tried to build a $400 million stadium and threatened to leave the community if they didn't build it. The community was pissed about this. They showed they were angry, they protested, they put petitions forward, and the stadium wasn't built. The Atlanta Rams stayed in the community because clubs realize they care about their community and they want them to come back to the games, buy their merchandise, and pay for their tickets. But importantly, still no analysis on why even if they move stadiums, even if they move, why those fans still can't watch the game, appreciate it, and be proud that their club embodies the essence of their city, of that town. South Korean fans, even though they aren't in Manchester United, can appreciate them. The biggest rivalry in baseball history, the New York Yankees, passionate fans from all over the country, even though most people don't live in New York. Before I get into my third level, I think you're right.
The international fans can still watch things on TV, however, it is easier for them to
Okay,
gain accessibility to
I'll actually get onto that now. So thirdly about the protesters. Firstly, we think they've given a meaningful analysis why the protest is so valuable, why it can't be done in other forums, and why the communities and private owners who want to keep a politically neutral club and a profit and keep people, everyone happy, can't respect this. They give no analysis why it's so detrimental to sport. But fourthly, about foreign fans. Why are they doing nothing for them? Because it's no incentive for these clubs to break into foreign markets, but they don't have enough money to buy the broadcasting rights, to broadcast the games in South Korea. They have no incentive to build up the sport. That's why that Vivek Randy example of a millionaire who was willing to work at a loss to build up basketball to be a huge sport in this country was so valuable in India, where no community ownership would ever have any incentive to branch out, buy those broadcasting rights shown in. But lastly, about more competitive sports. And they say when less of a disparity between clubs, we get more competitive sports, it's more enjoyable for the fans. But firstly, the disparity will still exist. That Real Madrid will still be an extremely wealthy community that has half of the income of Spain compared to Brighton, which only has 200,000 fans and will not be able to fund the clubs to the same degree. How are they supposed to compete? The disparity will still exist. We understand what this debate about Team South Africa is taking.
So this speech lasted for 8 minutes and 8 seconds. I would like to thank the third speaker of the side position and invite the first vice speaker of the position.
We think that fans are essential to the success of any sport. We think that they're essential to the success of any business, any TV show, any song, right? But we don't give them ownership over that. We allow Game of Thrones to have a copyright, we allow Ed Sheeran to have a copyright, we allow all of them to own what their work because they made it and they own it. At no point do they tell us why consumers should then become owners. At no point do they tell us why no singer deserves a copyright over their own song, why no one deserves any ownership over anything because they happen to rely on other people for revenue. And that was crucial analysis. So they had to prove to you, well, that revenue directly means that you own it, and on that basis, we can violate any other legitimate form of ownership and impede on people who own it now. They never do that. They're using this debate. We're going to have to evaluate this debate on the following basis. They had to prove a couple of things. One, that the harm that they give to you is one which is unique, inherent, and of a large enough scale to warrant us putting in this policy. Secondly, they had to prove to you that their solution was one which is legitimate, but moreover one which is likely to be effective. They do none of these. Let's firstly talk about this harm, right? And this is why it's not inherent. We characterize to you that the incentive for profit in sport exists across public and private ownership. That is why Real Madrid, despite having 90,000 fans who are very, very invested, apparently, still is extremely expensive and inaccessible for those people, right? They never give us analysis on this. But we told you why it's specifically worse on their side. That they don't have a net of income to fall back on, and they can't afford to sink £1 billion into Chelsea like Roman Abramovich could, right? We told you that moreover, these private clubs are often willing to run a loss because they're so expensive. We told you that these communities don't have this money. They likely have more of a perverse incentive for that. What you're getting from that is that the core of all of their arguments, the core of inaccessibility, the core of shutting down bridges, the core of communities not benefiting is aggressive and worse on their side. Moreover, we think that the harm is not unique. It's something that exists across an entire market. Consumers may want more access to a thing. They may want more control over something. We don't think this was harm which is specifically inherent to sport. But moreover, that their harm is minor. That not all clubs actually want, that not all communities want to own their teams. They had to prove to us why there was such a pressing need for this, that we would apply it to the vast majority of teams, even those who didn't actually want this. What you're getting from this is that we think, aside from the fact, aside from the fact that we think that their harm is not inherent, unique, or scalable, right? What you're also getting from this is that it's not is that they're unlikely to be able to solve it because those harms are going to persist even under public ownership. Let's talk about the second clash of who rightfully owns them, and we never get any positive analysis from them. All positive analysis actually comes from opposition. And it was threefold. One, that private ownership is a legitimate form of ownership. They never actually respond to this, right? This is why it's damaging. Because they have to then prove to us why it's okay to impede on someone's legitimate rights to it. After after creating a product, after rightfully buying a product, why can we impede on that ownership? We never actually get this. The second part was the distinction between a consumer and an owner, something they also don't engage with, right? They just tell you that because you contribute, you ought to own it, right? They never actually engage with it. And that's why the POI on like whether or not fans should own TV shows and songs is actually important. Because they all contribute to that, but at no point do we say that you actually own it. The third part was how it's especially restricted. This was independent of them having a claim over it, but that claim would be restrictive to a local community and to fans who want to own it. The only response we actually get to this is, oh shame, geography is arbitrary anyway. That's not fair, right? But let's also look at their analysis on what international fans do, because they tell us that international fans are unaffected because they can watch the matches and they can buy them. At no point do we get any analysis for why those fans, who they claim are going to have somewhat of a heightened experience, cannot do that and cannot access that on their own side. Given that we've proven to you that we think the communities rightfully own them. The only actual analysis we get from them is that one, if the communities are likely to benefit, is legitimate. We characterize to you on our side how you cripple communities with debt and you limit their access to other sports they may not have previously known about, right? But moreover, they tell us about monopolies. We already characterize to you why we don't think this applies. We don't think that this is a monopoly. Given that, opposition is proven to you. Or we think that the harms that they've given you are not inherent and aren't likely to be solved on their side. But moreover, the communities do not rightfully own these teams and can therefore not impose that burden of ownership on everyone. And on that basis, we who value ownership in all of its transient forms ought to take this debate.
This speech lasts at 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I would like to thank the opposition reply speech and invite the proposition's reply speech to share the speech.
Estonia says that opposition has a very weird understanding on how these current professional sport teams actually work. Right? They try to claim throughout their speeches that private investors keep clubs and sports alive, and these billionaires investing is the things that never happen on our side. But we gave you these answers that this is a very small minority, and this really doesn't happen. I'm going to talk of this in my reply speech. So we see that reality is that smaller sports and smaller sports clubs are actually surviving because they are publicly owned, because fans are the ones that actually care about these sports, and private investors really don't. Right? Private investors don't want to invest into some very small sport because there's no profit involved for them. They don't want to take this risk of losing all their money because they're doing it for profit, right? We say that fan-owned teams always can take those financial hits because they care about the social impacts more than any financial benefits that they try to claim. We say that the only reason why these lower sports teams and sports overall are alive because the fans are the ones who actually care, and the fans are the ones who get impacted, right? So firstly, what is currently going on in profit incentivized sports? We say that there's a low accessibility for sports like we told in your speeches, right? Ticket prices are high because there are profit incentives and people want to get as much money as possible being the club owner, right? We prove to you that this is very likely to change under our side, right? Fans want to get accessibility to those games, they want to see those games, that's why they will make it easier for them, or they will make it cheaper for them by providing cheaper tickets. For example, this also works for international fans. International fans can come and see the games for cheaper as well. We benefit them through this model as well. Second thing that is going on, there's a clear harm to fans, right? The example of NFL teams, 3 of 24 teams literally leaving the city to get more profit. There's a clear harm to fans. The fans can't now go and watch those games because those teams were so profit incentivized. This won't happen under our side because there's no incentive for fans to leave their own hometowns so they can see those matches. This is a thing that comparatively never happens on our side. Thirdly, currently competition is ruined because of profit incentive, right? But PSG in France wins every year because they live in debt and spend hundreds of millions of dollars, for example, on Neymar by buying him for $200 million, right? This again would never happen, or most likely wouldn't happen on our side because they can use that $200 million for integration, for building better sporting facilities, or basically increasing accessibility to, for example, sporting games. And even if that happened on our side, we say that is a fair thing because fans are the one who decide that, and this is their goal and their fulfillment. That's why it is is also good, right? We say that these are the things that are right now going on in profit incentivized sport that we have to recognize. These are the things that team opposition really didn't deal with, and this is the reality that they really didn't debate, right? Now, moving on, who has a claim to these teams actually, right? We say that even though we get this case about how geography is arbitrary and all of these negative impacts from it being arbitrary, we say that this is the real world, right? Local fans have a claim because they live in the areas that could be impacted the most from these model ownership rights. Versus on the opposition, these local fans and international fans have no, and both of them have no access because profit incentivized sports means that you're never going to sell your shares, for example, those local and international fans. So already comparatively, we are better even if geography is, for example, arbitrary, right? We say the under opposition and the status quo, international fans never lose out under a model because they can still watch the games from TV because the under ownership model, for example, fan owning those teams, we're still going to sell TV rights, we're still going to sign sponsorship deals. This is the reality that we live in. These international fans are not going to be left out basically basically left out so they can see these games, right? We say that the ownership model basically gives benefit to every other fan that is currently, for example, a Manchester United fans, but gives the most benefit to Manchester people living in the Manchester area, and these are the inherent things that our model achieves and the inherent benefits that we get on our side and are comparatively never come out from their side. These are all the reasons why you should vote for us. Thank you.
Alright, the speech lasted for 4 minutes and 2 seconds. I would like to thank all the speakers for this speech. And please leave the classroom so that the educators can make their
Oh.